If you could take your seats, that'd be great. And we can get started. I'm sure there will be people filtering in for the next little while. Lots of good seats down here, guys. Well, hello and good afternoon. My name is Danny Rosenberg. I'm a Brock faculty member, and I'll be your moderator for today's program. And here are the program guidelines. Please turn off or mute your cell phones. Please adhere to the guidelines. Be courteous and civil at all times. Please be respectful of the speakers by not creating any disturbances or distractions while they're speaking. And at the end, when we have a Q&A session, please ask relevant questions in an orderly way and permit the speakers to answer your questions without any interruptions. So those are the ground rules. Before introducing our speakers, I want to say thank you to the sponsors of this event and share a few opening remarks. So much appreciation is extended to the Brock Coalition Against Antisemitism, the Council of Muslims Against Antisemitism, the campus student group Chabad on campus, and the synagogue congregation B'nai Israel of St. Catherine's. Antisemitism, broadly understood as, quote, hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group, has a long history. For millennia, Jews have been persecuted, forcibly expelled from their ancestral homeland, and many communities where they resided, and were often killed for no other reason than their being Jews. When Islam emerged in the 7th century of the Common Era and spread across Arabia, the Levant, and northern Africa, the Muslim attitude toward Jews was one of contempt. Yet they were tolerated somewhat in various lands and under different rulers as second-class sojourners. References to Jews in the Quran are controversial, some are negative, yet many ancient Jewish prophets are acknowledged in the Quran, especially Moses, who was revered. This attitude changed dramatically in the 19th and 20th centuries when European influence took hold primarily in the Middle East. Christian anti-Semitism infiltrated Muslim thought and behavior, so much so that several notorious pogroms and blood libels against Jews erupted in several Arab Muslim cities in the 19th century. The pogrom in Amsterdam less than a week ago is the latest example of vicious hatred and violence against Jews, perpetrated mostly by Muslims. By the first half of the 20th century, when European racial and political anti-Semitism proliferated, Muslim writers and leaders like Muhammad Rashid Rida, Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, promulgated an anti-Semitic annihilationist posture towards Jews and declared jihad, holy war, against them in the name of Islam. These were the harbingers of today's Muslim terrorist organizations in countries that sponsor them and engage in their own terrorism. Their teachings and those of many religious and political figures since then are supported by hundreds of millions of Muslims across the globe. Polls taken in several Middle Eastern countries and regions reveal almost 100% of Muslims hold unfavorable attitudes toward Jews, except in Israel, where about 2 million Arab Muslims have full citizenship. The unprovoked anti-Semitic inspired attack into Israel of 3,000 plus Hamas terrorists and Gazan civilians on October 7 of last year that resulted in the barbaric killing, raping, mutilating, burning, and beheading of over 1,200 Jews and non-Jews, young and old alike, and the kidnapping of over 250, of which 101 are either still languishing in captivity or are dead, led to a significant increase of anti-Semitism across the world and on college campuses, including here at Brock. How and why does anti-Semitism exist? And is it an obsession with many, when there are only 15 million Jews worldwide, and more than half of them living in Israel? There are over 2 billion Muslims on the planet, and about 50 Muslim-majority countries. Yet the current senseless hatred of and mania to harm and kill Jews are mostly expressed and fueled by Muslims and their supporters. Fortunately, we have today two morally courageous Muslims who reject anti-Semitism, our two speakers, who today will address the topic, the Muslim case against anti-Semitism. I will introduce our two speakers, they will then address us, and we will conclude with a Q&A session. Our first speaker, Raheel Raza, is the president of the Council of Muslims Facing Tomorrow, is a founding member of the Muslim Reform Movement, director of the Forum for Learning, president of the steering committee of the Council for Muslims Against Antisemitism, is a member of the National Advisory Board of the Abraham Global Peace Initiative. She is an award-winning journalist, public speaker, TV personality, and an advocate for human rights, gender equality, and dignity and diversity. She serves on numerous boards, has received several awards for her activism, including the Medal of Courage by the Simon Wiesenthal Center. She's addressed different parliaments around the world, has authored 2 books on Islam, and taught college and university courses about Islam. Her goals are to expose the dangers of radical Islamist ideology and educate youth about the dangers of radicalization and terrorism. Our second speaker, Syed Sohail Raza, has been a keen observer of politics in the Muslim world for decades, especially in Pakistan. His 35-year distinguished career in the airline industry in Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and Canada, plus his living in Baghdad, have given him deep insights into Middle East politics. He comes from a prominent Pakistani family with ties to military intelligence, diplomacy, and bureaucracy. Sohail has appeared in the mainstream media and has commented on Muslim geopolitics and how this relates to the Canadian Muslim diaspora. He is the recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for Service to Canada and has also taught college courses on politics and Islam. It is an honor and a privilege to have these two speakers with us today. Therefore, please welcome Raheel Raza to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Brock University, Danny Rosenberg, and the sponsors for inviting us here to address this current and very urgent issue. As Danny said, my name is Raheel Raza. I'm a Pakistani by birth and a Canadian by choice, and Islam is my spiritual journey. While growing up in Pakistan, there was no conversation or information about Israel or the Jewish community. But I had access to libraries, and I read the Diary of Anne Frank when I was about 10 years old, and then later on as a teenager, I read Exodus. And I was very curious about a people I had never met. Fast forward to 1989, when we migrated to Canada. Here, we met diverse communities, including members of the Jewish community. With some reservation, in 2008, we took our first trip to Israel. It was an amazing trip, full of questions and curiosity about a people whom we knew little about, but had heard a lot of controversial views about. As we traveled across the country and met people from all walks of life, we were in awe at the diversity and freedoms presented by the only democracy in the Middle East. This is where my love affair started between Israel and me. After that, I traveled to Israel 13 times. And by the way, the 13th time when I was there, the immigration officer in Tel Aviv airport asked me, "So where's your Israeli passport?" I said, "Do you know something that I don't?" But I was invited every year to speak at the conference called Facing Tomorrow, which was hosted by the late Shimon Peres. I also was invited to speak at the ICCT, counterterrorism conferences, and various legal and political forums. So it was an opportunity. Sometimes I went twice a year, sometimes, but regularly, every year for 13 years. During these trips, I got armed with first-hand knowledge and had interaction with people. And therefore, I was able to refute conspiracy theories about Israel and the Jews. And these trips also galvanized us into understanding the scourge of anti-Semitism, and we started speaking out against hate. I'm a journalist. I started writing about it. I was also accredited for 5 years to the United Nations Human Rights Council, another place where bias against Israel is loud and clear, specifically by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. So my work was cut out for me. I looked around for representatives from the Jewish community in Israel who would refute the propaganda that was being spouted against them, but there weren't many, so I took it upon myself to be a defender of Israel. I'm talking about 20 years ago. So I should point out that the Council of Muslims Against Antisemitism was not created as a reaction to the horrific Hamas attacks on October 7th. CMAA, which actually constitutes Muslim scholars, academics, and activists from across the globe, came into being long before October 7th, because we saw that the underlying factors in the Middle East conflict are not only political differences, it's because of it's the rise of a form of hate that the world has not seen for centuries. And I call this the new anti-Semitism. Obviously, in the aftermath of October 7th, our work intensified and became all the more urgent because we felt it imperative that Muslim voices like ours be heard to show allyship and support for our Jewish brothers and sisters, and also, more importantly, to distinguish between right and wrong, to distinguish between good and evil. We also understand that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It's a global scourge, and it's a disease that can't be cured by swallowing 2 Tylenols. It has to be surgically removed. So we formed CMAA selfishly, because as Muslims, when we see extremism and terrorism emanate from our own faith, we feel compelled to speak out. Jew hatred is an underlying factor of extremism, and my colleague Sohail will expound more on that. As far as Islam as a faith is concerned, there are 2 aspects at play today: the spiritual side and the political side. The key question is anti-Semitism alive in both, or has it been used for political purposes? So I'll take a moment to explore the question, are there Islamic roots of anti-Semitism? First of all, let me clarify the difference between religion and politics, because religion is not politics and politics is not religion. When the 2 intertwine, we have Islamism, or political Islam, which is an ideology based on institutionalizing Sharia laws. Islam and Islamism very clearly are not the same thing. Islamism is a totalitarian ideology and a perversion of Islam. If anti-Semitism is removed from this ideology, it dwindles. Classical Islam, on the other hand, is a faith like Judaism and Christianity, and in fact it has its roots in the 2 Abrahamic faiths. In my understanding, you can't be a good Muslim unless you embrace Judaism and Christianity, which are referred to in the Quran, our holy book, as Ahl al-Kitab, people of the book. It's important to understand the context in which Islam and Judaism exist. The main point on Muslim and Arab anti-Semitism is that there is no basis, nor can there be for Muslims to draw upon the Quran to stigmatize the Jews. The Quran, as a revelation, cannot by definition contradict its own universal message of worship of one God, the God of Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, and Solomon. and of Jesus. Indeed, the Quran affirms the history of the Jews as the original people of the book. And through the history of Jews, Muhammad is instructed to teach the pagan Arabs to worship the one God of Abraham. Furthermore, when we Muslims pray 5 times a day, we bestow in every prayer blessings upon Abraham and his progeny, who are the Jews and the Christians. Since Muslims cannot draw upon the Quran to push their Judeophobia, they turn to secondary literature or hadiths, which is literature on the Prophet's life through which to stain the universal message of the Quran. But we know that hadith literature was largely fabricated to provide justifications to the Arab rulers who took power in the post-prophetic period and can't be trusted as being objectively true. So, Danny had put a question about reference to the Jews in the Quran. What about the verses in the Quran where Jews are admonished for their opposition to the Prophet? These verses are of a particular nature. They have no universal context, and nor are they any part of a universal message of worshipping the one God of Abraham. These verses are indicative of the opposition the Prophet had to surmount in his work, and this opposition came from different peoples, including the worst opposition that came to him from his own people, his own family, and it did not end with him as what followed after him with a terrible massacre of his family by Arabs. Moreover, Prophet Muhammad was not the first prophet to face opposition. All prophets have faced opposition, including Moses when he came down from Mount Sinai after receiving the 10 Commandments. But Prophet Muhammad's relationship with the Jews of Medina and his dealings with them belong to a special and particular instance of his life. That history cannot be appropriated by Muslims after him to justify their abuse of Jews, as they have wrongfully done, since the larger and more important and universal message is repeated over and over again in the Quran, that on the day of reckoning, none need have any fear of God the merciful, who have done good deeds, including Jews, Christians, Sabians, and others. This is a verse from the Quran. This universal message overrides the particular instances of the quarrels of the people with the Prophet, including the quarrels with the Jews of Medina. In modern times, Muslims have misused the Quran by using it to justify their own miserable politics, whether it is the Arabs against Jews or the Muslim army of Pakistan waging a genocidal war against Muslims in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, or the Muslim Arab army of Saddam Hussein massacring Kurdish and Shia Muslims, and such examples are innumerable, including what we are witnessing with the savagery of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Worldwide today, there are major conflicts, and people come to Canada because it's a safe haven. Monday was Remembrance Day to commemorate those who fought for our freedoms. Today, our freedoms are being trampled on the pretext of freedom of speech. But freedom of speech doesn't mean spreading hate and violence against educational institutions, businesses, places of worship, as we've seen in the aftermath of October 7th. All this got exposed. I'm a grandmother. I don't talk about problems without offering some solutions. So very quickly, solutions to the problem. Nearly all Muslim countries depend on financial, educational, and technological support from Western countries. Here, I need to emphasize the importance of correcting the curriculums of these countries and eliminating chapters on hate. So Western countries need to assure this change is made before giving aid. Domestically, we have to lobby our political leaders to ensure that hate does not take over our cities as it had in Canada. Our hope lies in peace-building efforts as initiated by the Abraham Accords, and more lobbying is needed to bring non-Arab Muslim countries into their fold. I have critics in my own community and the non-Muslim community, and I welcome this because debate and discussion is what leads to solutions. However, the next speaker has been my worst critic for over 3 decades and will probably refute everything I've said, so over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sohail Raza. I am a reluctant activist. I've been doing this since the last 10 years. My career has been with the airlines. So today we can spend the rest of our time discussing why your bags and yourself don't arrive on the same flight. How much does it cost if the flight is delayed, and various other interesting questions you may have. But coming back to the topic, my story is the same as Raheel, who just mentioned, and going to Israel changed me as well. Fighting anti-Semitism as a Muslim is one of the most challenging aspects of my life. Just when I thought I would retire and live happily ever after and use Air Canada's free passes, I have been put in this environment. And like Raheel said, I will definitely want to refute her. There's no question that anti-Semitism is deeply rooted in Islam. Now, especially after the creation of Israel. Before that, it was more of a European problem. But after the creation of Israel, the Muslims have taken over this horrible aspect. There are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world today. They live in 57 countries, which are termed Islamic by the OIC and the UN. 49 countries are totally Muslim majority. So do 1.8 billion Muslims, minus the 3 that are here, all hate the Jews? Just to give you an example, Israel could fit in one of the cities of Pakistan, Karachi for example. The area is the same, if not a bit larger, and there are about 20 million people there. So that's the size of Israel. That's the threat to 1.8 billion people, hypothetically. In history, Jews and Muslims have worked together. They've worked together in Spain, they've worked together in Baghdad when it was the most learned city in the world some centuries ago. And it's not that it can't happen again. And I can assure you it will happen again. It's just we have to get over a few obstacles first. One wonders how the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, and various other terror-inflicting groups gain Muslim support, and how they manipulate the faith to achieve their objectives. In order to understand this phenomena, I am attempting to explain a few important terminologies that have become part and parcel of the faith. They're not in the core faith, but today they are. Thus, very easily, it can be morphed into a hate phenomena. So these terminologies, if you understand them, you'll understand where Islam is headed today. The first one is blasphemy and apostasy. Now these terms pertain to Muslims and non-Muslims, but out of this is derived Jew hate. Blasphemy and apostasy means that if I leave the fold of Islam, I'm eligible to be killed. Or if you insult Islam today, you are rightfully eligible to be killed. This started after the death of the Prophet in something called Ridda Wars, when the tribes of Arabia came to the then ruler immediately after the death of the Prophet and said, look, Islam was very good while the Prophet was here, and we had an understanding and we had an agreement with him. Now he died. That agreement is null and void. That was what the terms of the contract were in Arabia in the 6th century. So, I'm sorry, but we can no longer be Muslims. So the rulers found this to be a threat and incorporated blasphemy and apostasy in the framework of Islam, so that those tribes were all killed. Those tribes were all defeated militarily. And since then, this has become part of Islam. Jihad, which you hear of every day, in the Quran and the teachings of Islam, there are various kinds of jihad. There is a jihad which is an internal struggle. There's a lesser jihad and a higher jihad and a jihad to protect yourself. It never means waging a war against anybody. But today, jihad means to kill infidels. Jihad, the term is now void. It should not exist, because jihad was instituted for tribal wars. Now we have nation states. We have the United Nations. One country fights against another, it's a declaration of war. So jihad is irrelevant in today's day and age. Another interesting terminology is Darul Harb and Darul Islam. Darul Islam is the land of Islam, where Muslims live in majority. Darul Harb is the land of non-Muslims. To go into Darul Harb as a Muslim, and this is also newly instituted, in fact it's not an original part of Islam. So if you go into Darul Harb, if I go or Raheel goes into Darul Harb, it means your duty as a Muslim is to go and convert people or wage war against them. So you're understanding with all these terminologies what is happening in the world today. There is a pattern behind it. The other challenge for us Muslims is that the Quran is not in chronological order. So it becomes very easy for extremists to pick and choose the verses. Kill the Jews, kill the infidels, whatever terminology they want to pick and explain as such, leading to hate. In this case, today, in today's world, against the Jewish community. Now, ironically, they ignore the verse and the page where Allah, God, has declared the land of Israel rightfully to Israelites or the Jews. You'll never hear any sermon regarding this in any mosque, no statement coming out of Muslim institutions, but it's there. There was a group of people in the 9th century called the Mutazilites. The Mutazilites claimed that all teachings of the Quran and the Hadith should be taught with reasoning and logic. We don't want anything else. We want to be able to reason it out. There's a very interesting chapter from the 9th century. Each and every, and they grew in numbers, they grew in thousands. Each and every one of the Mutazilites were put to death. So, although debate and discussion, called ijtihad in Islamic term in Arabic, is all about debate, discuss, challenge. The Prophet was challenged at many times. The Prophet, a woman came to Prophet 3 times and said, this religion doesn't agree with me. So after the 3rd time, he said, fine. To you, your faith, to me, mine. There's no compulsion in religion. That's also in the Quran. So there is debate, and people debated with him, why should we accept Islam? What is new in this religion? Islam, by the way, is also known as Judaism light, because it has, I think, 60 to 70% ingredients from Judaism and practices as well. Now, hadith, Raheel has explained that hadith is what the Prophet has said. That's another challenge for us. There are over 30,000 hadiths. I don't even think he spoke that much. 30,000 hadiths exist in the form of books. Out of 30,000, 4,000 are agreed by the larger majority of Muslims. Out of the 4,000, some sects only believe in 400. That this was actually said by the Prophet. But when a group of Muslims, like Hamas for instance, are challenged, their reply is, no, this is what the Prophet said and this is where it is, and they'll dig it up in some book that is completely nonsensical, and that gives them the legitimacy of what they do. So this is just for your interest, Muslim on Muslim violence. Statistically, Islam is 1400 years old. In 1400 years, more Muslims have been killed by fellow Muslims than non-Muslims. So there is a big, and Raheel mentioned, Pakistan war on East Pakistan, 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, Sudan, the war in Sudan, Saudi Arabia's recent war on Yemen, the tribal warfare in Afghanistan. Now the interesting part, what happened today? What is happening today in the Muslim world? Why have we come to this aspect that organizations or terrorist entities like Hamas are celebrated? So in 1979, Khomeini took over Iran and proclaimed that this takeover or this coup or this revolution has to be exported in the rest of the Muslim world. That immediately electrified Saudi Arabia, which has its own extremist Salafi ideology theories. Saudi Arabia is now undergoing a reform under the Crown Prince, but at that time it was staunchly, extremely violent in its ways it dealt with people. So today, the Muslim world is divided into 3 groups. The Khomeinites, people from the IRGC, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. The Muslim Brotherhood, which, as you alluded, Hassan al-Banna, Sayyid Qutb, a very dangerous phenomena, and the Wahhabi Salafi ideology. These are the 3 groups. The Khomeinis work with the Muslim Brotherhood, although one is Shia, one is Sunni. But when Khomeini took over, he adopted the working model, the political model of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why they have the Sharia police. If your hair are showing in women, they beat you, and unfortunately, some of them have died as well. So this is how the world is divided. In the question and answer period, you can ask me which country falls under which area. And the turf wars started even in Pakistan, in Africa, in the Arab world, based on these three ideologies. Then we come to reform. Is it possible to reform Islam? I don't think the actual religion can be reformed, but the Muslims can easily be reformed in looking at Islam in a different light. It is possible, and a Muslim reform movement has started in North America by well-known Muslim leaders like Zudi Jasser, who was a Marine and is now a politician in Phoenix, Arizona, Asran Nomani, who was a Wall Street journalist who accompanied Daniel Pearl, if you remember, long time ago, and he was beheaded in Pakistan. And she was with him at that time. And they've started a Muslim reform movement. And again, not to reform the actual text, but in light of the text, to illuminate to Muslims how we can understand that. I'll give you an example. A Quran comes from Saudi Arabia, which has the opening chapter. And the opening chapter says, "Oh God, please guide me to be people you have chosen to be on the right path, and not those who have left you and gone astray." This is the translation of the verse. So the Saudi translation, the Salafi Wahhabi translation, where it says, people gone astray, in brackets, Jews and Christians. So 1.8 billion people, even half of them, if they subscribe to the Salafi Wahhabi ideology, can you imagine the damage that is causing and the hatred that is coming out? And all these points lead to only one thing: Jew hatred. And why? Because after the creation of Israel, the Muslim states had lost the caliphate, the Turkish Ottoman Caliphate. The Mughals had lost power in India. So they were in a decline. And being in a decline, they needed a boogeyman, or they needed something that they can lash out their anger at. And lo and behold, the state of Israel in the Arab world, Jews living amongst the Muslims, was the easiest target. So the Muslim leaders used this as a crutch and have created an enemy to deflect from their own problems, shortcomings, and lack of development. On the part of Israel and the Jewish communities, there is a slight problem that they view Muslims only through the lens of the Arab-Israel conflict. At the time like this, Israel needs to make more efforts to extend the olive branch to non-Arab Muslim states, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan. So more work needs to be done. So yes, while anti-Semitism is intertwined today in the geopolitics of Islam, there are branches of Islam like the Sufis and Muslims yearning for reform in the way they interpret and practice their faith, and those who use reason and logic. Out of 1.8 billion Muslims, if you are generous, take out 0.8 billion. So we still have to work on 1 billion in terms of changing the way of thinking from hating the other to accepting diversity in faith. Unless we do this together, we don't stand a chance. So this is not a Jewish problem. It's not anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It's not a Muslim problem. It is our problem. If there are things happening in the streets of Toronto, it's our problem, collectively. Now to end, I just want to share in a lighter vein. In the world of Abrahamic religions, we see Jews as grandparents. They know it all, they've experienced it all, they are the ever wise. Christians are like parents. They know, but they still haven't figured it out yet. Islam is like the very troubled teenager. So you have to give it some space. We are still in a very troubled state, but we'll get there. I have hope, and as they say, tikwa? Tikwa. Have tikwa, and I'm sure we can look, and I think the worst is over in the Middle East, and I think peace should prevail. I know eyebrows are being raised, but that is our hope. And of course, once the enemy is defeated and once the hostages come home, we can yearn for peace. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Just sit here. Portable mic. Oh, face. Sure. Questions? Please.
First of all, thank you very much for coming. Anybody who tries to swim against the tide, wherever that tide is, has an uphill battle or against the current. It seems to me, though, that in your presentation, you ended up where you should have begun. Because from my point of view, the problem began with the end of the Ottoman Empire, the loss of the caliphate, and the struggle between the caliphate that was left and the concept of the nation state. And at that very moment that the caliphate was lost, pan-Arabism arose. And you're not wrong when you say that for want of a better way of describing it, the pan-Arabists were looking for a boogeyman to bring them together. Enter Zionism, that decided, that chose to take that moment to return to the Holy Land, to their ancestral roots. And from the pan-Arab world, this was an intrusion. In 1948, when Israel declared itself as a state, and the Arab states around Israel invaded or attacked, it wasn't about anti-Semitism, it was about anti-Zionism. It was about founding the state of Israel. And since that time, using your analogy of grandparents and parents and young children, on top of that came all the other things. Modernization, the inability to deal with the modern world, the lack of a concept of the nation state in the Arab world, and then the multiple wars between Israel and its Arab partners.
Excuse me, do you have a question though?
I'm asking, I would like them to comment on that. Sorry. And I'm going to end with only the fact that the recent activity has morphed into anti-Semitism because it becomes easy for everybody else to understand. And the young people today don't understand the roots of where all of this began.
Okay.
Do you agree?
Why do you like to comment on any of that?
Sure, yes, I agree to a certain point. Anti-Semitism is very easy to erupt because it's always dormant. So, yes, in 1948, Israel was created, but so were 12 other states. Jordan, Syria, Bahrain, Qatar, all these were created at the same time. And yes, because it is a Jewish state, it has to be fought against, it has to be expelled from that territory. So, yes, you're absolutely right. The end of the Ottoman Empire led the Muslims into a total abyss. They didn't know how to grapple. Their downfall came when they declared the printing press as a sinful thing that has entered science. So once they did, now the printing press is everywhere. Now the Muazzin gives the call to prayer on a loudspeaker, which was also banned. So their inability to deal with modernity, like you said, has led us into a problematic state that we still haven't gotten out of.
Thank you.
Someone else? Yes? Right.
First of all, thank you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for your bravery, and thank you for your optimism. Thank you for that. I think I followed your explanation of why anti-Semitism is within Islam. But if I did follow it, then I guess by similar logic, anti-Christianity, anti-Buddhism, anti-everything else other than Islam is also within Islam. But we don't really, it's not that it's not there, I know it's there, but we don't really see that as much as we see anti-Semitism.
In India, is
Okay, we hate everybody, including ourselves, so equally.
Well, no, it's not equally.
So why anti-Semitism is because yes, we do hate everybody equally because at one place the Quran lumps it together as Yahudun Nisar, Christians and the Jews. So they are not following the message that they received, and they are overdoing certain practices. That's in the Quran. So both of them are, and don't befriend them. So they are both there. But like I said, anti-Semitism was a European problem. It became after Zionism or after Judaism entered the Arab world. It became a little bit above water, and it's very easy. You know, there are 54 Muslim countries. They can't fight 63 Christian countries. They can fight one tiny Jewish state. So, like this gentleman said, that it's erupted. It's very easy. I shouldn't use the word, otherwise you'll call security, to hate the Jews. It's simpler than complicating with Christianity. And in India, there is anti-Hindu versus anti-Muslim, it's the reverse. So I think, and you know what? There are various kinds of oppositions. I don't like Hinduism because they have various levels, the caste system, etc. And I argue and I debate with people. I don't like Christianity as a Muslim because they call Jesus Son of God. That's not agreeable to us. So I can debate with them, discuss with them. But there's no hate. Where is the hate coming from? And even if there are political divides, if there's a matter of land and a matter of Palestinian rights, where does the hate come in? And we have borrowed it from the Europeans, that this is maybe the way to treat this community, because it's already been done before.
If we get a question from the upper tier. Okay, and anything for Raheel?
So, you have mentioned that Israel has a sort of a problem that they have to forward an olive branch to Arab countries.
Non-Arab countries.
Non-Arab countries.
Arab countries they've been dealing with since 1948. They've had
I mean, sorry,
5 wars.
Muslim countries
Yeah.
like, you say, Indonesia, Malaysia.
Yeah.
But they've been doing it for quite some time. They've offered, they had the peace with Egypt, with Jordan, they're trying now, they're working on Saudi Arabia. My question is, if they were to offer an olive branch, let's say to Malaysia or Indonesia, will that stop the hate? Will they accept Israel? And I'm sorry, one more thing. I just found out, I didn't really know that, or maybe I didn't know, but I sort of read about it, that, for example, in the West Bank, they teach the kids to hate. They teach the kids terrorism. And I think this is the root of the problem. If they will understand not to teach it to the kids, wouldn't that start at least a step forward in some kind of a peace of accepting Israel, accepting Jews?
No, I'll answer then you.
No,
Yeah.
no, answer. Wait your turn. In response to your question, the hate is coming from a solid diet in the curriculums of hate. When children at a very young age are taught that hate, there's an entire generation who has been fed on these curriculums. And I had mentioned that Western countries, when they give aid, it must be incumbent on changing the curriculum. Saudi Arabia did change the curriculum, so it is possible. It used to happen there as well. We intercepted books in Islamic schools here that were coming from Iran, and we reported them, and so they were taken out of the Canada curriculums. So that's where the change has to come, where an entire generation has to be re-educated that hate is never a solution.
There was a question up at the top, yes?
So, thank you. You're kind of leading into the question I had, which was, both of you are here in Canada. What is, and I heard the word hope and tikva, like, yay. But what are some of your suggestions in terms of what's happening here in Canada? I've got a colleague here who's a teacher, and things are being handed out that are like a lot of pro-Palestinian, and I don't know, and lots of separations and divisions between families. And I know that, as you're standing up, I know that you're facing that in your own families, right? So I'm just curious, what are some of the strategies either that you've used in your families, and also maybe if you have some ideas or suggestions on how to kind of, stand up to hate that's happening here.
Yeah, I'll hand it over to Raheel. But 10 years ago, I hope our hopes and aspirations for any conflict to be resolved lay in the universities where we are sitting here today. Unfortunately, the universities have lost that ability to groom people to debate and discuss. And we have that problem as well. But
Thank you for that question. I gave this deep thought this morning when I heard that on Remembrance Day, the poppy was being appropriated by the other side to say poppies for peace for Palestine. I mean, peace for Palestine is a very good thing, but to appropriate Canadian symbols and cultures. It took me back 20 years ago, after 9/11, when we started saying that what is happening all over the world is not isolated. Connect the dots. This was an article of mine. Right now, what is happening, you have to connect the dots. Your values, our freedoms are being appropriated in these little actions. And when no reaction takes place, when our leadership and our law enforcement doesn't do anything to right this then becomes the norm. So how much of our values and symbols and freedoms do we want to let go of? Each one of you has the capacity to stand up and speak out. And it's so clear what's right and what's wrong. And so we always have to stand up for what's right.
Exactly.
Even at a risk, as you said. Death threats, lawsuits, hate mail. When you have to have a hate mail folder in your computer, that's not very nice. And as far as the family is concerned, I talk to my grandchildren, help them understand the situation, because they go to school, they're in high school, they hear all sorts of conspiracy theories. But we talk to them, we communicate, and let them think for themselves what's right and what's wrong.
Critical thinking.
Yes, please.
I have a question. I'm just wondering how receptive is the Muslim community towards reform ideas that you are promoting in Canada and around the world?
You know, in North America and Europe, the idea of reform is very attractive. One of the parts of this reform is the equality of genders. And that has never existed in these patriarchal, misogynist societies. So that gives hope to the women. We now have women imams, and more women are opening their own mosques. So the movement is very attractive, especially to the younger generation. And so we are hoping that it will take off. We've got members from America, Canada, Europe, 3 female imams in Europe. So we do have hope.
Yeah. One of the things that helped to prevent religious violence in the Western world was the concept of the separation of religion and state. Are there bases in Islam for such separation, for that idea?
Yes, the majority of the countries are, even Saudi Arabia, there's a distinct separation of church and state. The royal family rules. The mullahs make all the nonsensical laws and carry on. So it is very much there, but it's a little different from the Western way of separating church and state. The religion is always intertwined with politics in Islam.
Just to follow up on that, I think a better question might be the totalitarian regimes in the Muslim Arab world, and why haven't, and what's the resistance to embrace democracy? Because I think that's a big challenge. I mean, you're talking about other things, but you have freedoms, democracy. You mentioned Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Why is there always an attraction to totalitarianism and the leaders and ruthlessness of leaders?
The misuse of religion. Islam as a faith has always been taught politically. And all the things I mentioned, they're not there in the faith, but they've become part of Islam as a political tool. So why is it that the Iranian regime, having killed so many of its own people, is still thriving? Because in the rural areas, which is the majority in, I would say, most Muslim countries, they are drenched in religiosity. And it is only once you give them the correct form of religion are they going to get out of it. Otherwise, they'll keep subjugating themselves to these totalitarian. I mean, all of Middle East was caught up in that. It's just now they are freeing themselves. But the domino will fall the day Saudi Arabia recognizes Israel. The reason being that most countries rely on Saudi oil, and they are being funded to develop technology. So it's going to be a big breakthrough.
So that's the source of your hope that Saudi Arabia will lead this reform?
Not the only source of hope, but it's one of the things that I can foresee coming happening.
And I can add to that through the Abraham Accords, there is now great trade going on between the United Arab Emirates and Israel and other countries, Bahrain, Oman. So there is hope in these, agreements that are there. And of course, we must remember that education is a very important part. Those countries in which half or less than half the population is illiterate, they're very gullible to any kind of ideology and religion. So it has, again, to start from the grassroots.
Just a quick follow-up on that. United Arab Emirates, we've lived there for 10 years. It was quite religious in a way. Today, they look at Israel completely differently. Completely. Why? Because they've got the money, but they don't have the technology. So they are going to emulate Israel in the form of technical development and armed forces development and stuff like that. So their attitude, there's a synagogue now in Dubai, unheard of in the Middle East. So that's new, and they celebrate and they go every Saturday, and they're Jews living in Dubai. So that is what gives us hope, that the Abrahamic Accord will break that stereotyping and that hate. Take out the hate and I can pick on any of you for an argument. The element of hate should be gone.
If we could have just one or two more questions, because they need to leave.
I just wanted to clarify one point when the lady in the second row was talking about how Christians aren't hated by the Islamic world, I believe. Actually, there's 16.7 million Christians in sub-Saharan Africa who are terribly persecuted. And there's just hundreds and hundreds in Nigeria regularly who are being killed, and it's all over. There used to be a very thriving, for hundreds and hundreds of years, a thriving Christian community in Iraq that was completely eradicated by ISIS. And Iranian Christians are always persecuted. All over the Middle East, Christian populations have been eradicated. So the hate isn't just focused, it's focused on just non-Muslims. Yeah, non-Muslims in different ways.
I'm sorry. There's no hate there. They just brutalize them because they are the majority. They just kill them. In Pakistan, I've seen it with my own eyes how the Christians are treated. But I didn't see them being treated like that because they hate them.
It's not a justification. But
No, it's not a justification. It's just that.
You're saying it's an persona, but that, I mean, that's a fruit of hatred to massacre.
You're absolutely right, but I'm saying the level of hate that is towards one country and one people is not the same for others. They are a minority. They can be dealt with any way we want. As a Pakistani, I can deal with the Christians any way I want. And they can't talk back because we slapped the blasphemy law on them. So they live meekly. So we subjugate them.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, I have a question for Syed.
Yes.
You mentioned that it's worthwhile to try to reform Muslim people, but it would not be, I guess, I'm not really sure what your take on this was, but shouldn't try to reform the religion itself? Why is that?
the text.
No, I'm saying there's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world today. They will not, at the moment, accept any changes made to the Quran, to the personality of the Prophet, to the way we believe in the aspects of the Muslim faith, prayers, fasting, going for pilgrimage. These are things that the Muslims won't tolerate any change. What they will tolerate a change in is how do we deal with the other? Should it be always ferociously and militarily and through expression of hate the other, and it will at all times should be considered than the other? So that is where the change should come and will come.
Final question.
Thank you for letting me speak.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to jihad and modern anti-Semitism. I have a slightly different view. I'd like to hear your opinion about it. Salah ad-Din, about 400 years after Muhammad, I think what he did was jihad
Yeah.
against the Crusaders. Right?
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia nowadays, what the state symbol is, two crossed swords.
Right.
Isn't this jihad? This is jihad too. When Jews first came to so-called Palestine, the first one, well, the war was always a small grain of Jews in Israel that or Palestine with them. But in 1882, started the kind of Zionist immigration to Israel. There was no conflict then. And when Jews wanted to get a land, they bought the land from the Arabs. Now the Arabs in Palestine and other neighboring countries, part of the Ottoman Empire, had no national identity. They were just poor,
Bedouins or wanderers.
whatever, citizens, or I don't even know whether citizen is the right word, of the Ottoman Empire that was descending. So when Jews came in, there was no conflict. The conflict began in earnest with Lawrence of Arabia, when he ignited pan-Arabic nationalism.
Yeah.
And this is way before 1948. And well, there were murders in Hebron and other places in 38, 39. Now, when Israel, let's go back to what you said about borrowing anti-Semitism from Europe. It's partially true. I mean, Husseini went to Hitler and so forth. But the problem, the real problem, and this is where the big anti-Semitism, I think, begins or explodes, is when Israel conquered Jerusalem and the mosque
In 1967.
on Mount Zion, which is, so I'd like to see what you think about, because it's to say that jihad was something that belonged to tribal wars, I mean, it's historically maybe true, but it continues all the way, and part of it has developed into the anti-Semitism.
Last comment.
Okay, no question of that. Yes, and it's complicated, the history of that part of the world. But yes, it started from Lawrence of Arabia, it's Saladin, throughout the Crusaders. So all these are history. We should be interested in how we can solve today's problem. What I saw on the streets in Canada was not tribal war or a war of, I saw pure hatred. When you can burn the Canadian flag, when you can go to a platform and say on the 26th of November we are going to celebrate Sinwar. These are things you are pushing the envelope and pushing the hatred envelope and wanting a reaction. But my gratitude to the Jewish community living so close to this is that they didn't react in any negative manner. There was no halal meat shop that was attacked. There was no Uber driver or limo driver who was a Muslim who was attacked. None. Zero incidents. So this is where the hope is. This is where, I mean, today we can look at history and learn from them and the nation states and jihad. But like I said, the jihad is now being misused and taken out of context. That ended there. Until Saladin came, there were no nation states. It's just that after the United Nations and after the First World War, the nation states were formed. So We don't need jihad
I
anymore.
had the last word. You'll be happy to know that in the Muslim reform movement, we have a push towards taking the term armed jihad and parking it in the 7th century parking lot, and not to apply it in today's world. And this goes for many aspects that were okay for the 7th century, but not for today. We're saying put them aside and move on.
Like slavery.
This is very, very enlightening. You are two magnificent people who are bringing a message that not many people hear. We've given what we see in the mainstream media, and you've touched on, I think, many of the core issues and problems, and also offered some solutions. And I share with everybody the hope that we will find peace with all communities, learning to live together, cooperating, and advancing Canadian society as a whole. So thank you very much. That ends our program, so good evening to you, and look for our next program that we're doing.